see what I look like. um, so I'm Julie Devers. I am the state biologist for NRCS, and advance my slides. And the presentation that I'll be giving today is about wildlife in Maryland. And I'll start off by giving an overview of NRCS priority wildlife and fisheries in Maryland. And then I'll talk just briefly about where to find some information on the FOTG. I'll talk about some programs that you can use for wildlife habitat restoration. And then I'll do a little deeper dive into the habitat types and practices to address resource concerns. So just to get started, there's a wide diversity of fish and wildlife in Maryland. We have 90 species of mammals, 93 species and subspecies of reptiles and amphibians, over 400 species of birds, hundreds of species of marine and freshwater fishes, and an unknown number of invertebrates, including insects, crustaceans, spiders, mollusks, etc. And the state of Maryland considers 300 of these species rare. You can read about those in the State Wildlife Action Plan. And the state of Maryland has listed 110 species as threatened and endangered. Of those species, some of them are federally listed as well. There are 2 freshwater mussels, 2 beetles, 3 fish, 1 turtle, 1 bird, and 2 bats that are federally listed as threatened or endangered species. And in addition, there are some species that don't spend their entire life in Maryland, including 2 migratory birds, 5 sea turtles, and 6 whales that are listed as threatened or endangered. There are also a number of plant species that are listed, which are also under the Fish and Wildlife Service, but they are plant species. In addition to the broad diversity of species, we also have a large diversity of habitat types. So I'm just going to give you a brief kind of tour of Maryland habitat types. So in the western part of Maryland, we have the Allegheny Plateau, and a lot of the farming is done up on the plateau, and then the ravines and valleys are forested, and at the bottom of these valleys are streams and rivers that have some pretty cool species, including native brook trout. And then kind of in the ridge and valley area, as well as the Allegheny Plateau, we have kind of our most forested area in Maryland. And in some of the openings and clearings in the forest, we have golden wing warbler habitat. In the Piedmont, kind of in the north central area of Maryland, we have some special habitat in the wetlands, in particular type of wetland that are bogs, and we have bog turtle habitat that's kind of rare in that northern part of the Piedmont. And then we have the upper coastal plain that has a lot of great pollinator habitat and opportunity for pollinator restoration. And really we have that all throughout the state. We have opportunities for restoration of pollinator habitat. And then on the lower coastal plain, on the eastern shore, there are lots of wetlands and also a lot of wetlands that have been drained. And so where there's marginal farmland, we have opportunities to restore wetlands for waterfowl, including black ducks. We have a lot of partners that we work with to ensure that the habitat restoration that we do is best for the species that we're trying to restore it for. Our main state partner is the Maryland Department of Natural Resources, and they have 3 different divisions that we mainly work with. There are a couple of other divisions that we also work with, but Wildlife and Heritage is in charge of wildlife and also the non-game species. We also work very closely with the Forest Service and Fisheries Division. We also work with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. This is kind of the main federal partner in charge of wildlife. And they have an Ecological Services Office, the Chesapeake Bay Field Office here in Annapolis, Maryland. And they have divisions that work on private lands. It's their partners program and coastal program, as well as the Endangered Species Division that helps us with our consultations for endangered species. There are also refuges under the Fish and Wildlife Service in Maryland. Blackwater is the biggest one out on the eastern shore. And then we also have Patuxent on the western shore and a couple of other smaller refuges. And there's also a fisheries and aquatic conservation office in the same building as Chesapeake Bay Field Office under the Fish and Wildlife Service. We also work closely with the Chesapeake Bay program. The Chesapeake Bay program is a partnership of Bay states, so all of the states in the Chesapeake Bay watershed, along with federal agencies, including the EPA, NOAA, Fish and Wildlife Service, the U.S. Geological Survey, and several other federal agencies. And they work together on the Chesapeake Bay Watershed Agreement. And you may interact with the Chesapeake Bay program through their best management practices or through the watershed implementation planning. And then we also have a number of nonprofit organizations that help us with habitat restoration and making sure that we're doing good habitat restoration. So these include the Nature Conservancy, the Chesapeake Bay Foundation, the Xerces Society that works on invertebrate species, Ducks Unlimited, Trout Unlimited, the Audubon Society, and Western Maryland RC&D. And there are a number of other organizations that we also work with. These are the main ones. And then I'm just going to highlight the priority habitats that we work on. And I'll go do a little bit deeper dive on these in a little bit. So we have grassland bird habitat, early successional habitat, hardwood forests, streams and riparian forest, wetlands and shallow water habitats, and oyster habitat. So to learn a lot more about what we can do on these habitats than what I can tell you in this presentation, you can go to the FOTG and go down to section 2G, Fish and Wildlife Guidance, and then you can go to the Maryland Wildlife Habitat Planning Guide. And it has a lot of really great guidance that has been put together over the years. So some of the programs that we can use to do wildlife habitat restoration and conservation are the Conservation Reserve Enhancement Program. This is a partnership between the FSA, the Farm Service Agency, NRCS, and the state of Maryland, and has the objective of improving water quality and habitat restoration for wildlife. We also have the Conservation Stewardship Program. This is where producers are already doing a great job with conservation, and they can get paid to continue doing good conservation and do additional enhancements. There are quite a number of enhancements that are for wildlife. This is just a screenshot of the national webpage that you can find a whole bunch of enhancements that are particularly for wildlife that you can do for CSP. And then EQIP, the Environmental Quality Incentives Program. A lot of the scenarios and practices that we do under EQIP benefit wildlife in either directly or tangentially, but 10% of the funding each year needs to go directly to wildlife habitat conservation restoration. So under EQIP, we have Working Lands for Wildlife, and throughout the country, there are both national initiatives and state initiatives. You can find this on the NRCS website as well. And we have 4 initiatives here in Maryland: bobwhite quail, golden wing warbler, bog turtle, and American black duck. Here are pictures of those species. And just a note that we do have nationally tracked wildlife targets. So in CD, just make sure that you're tagging wildlife as you use these practice codes. And then we have the ASAP WRE program. And this is a program to restore wetlands and then protect those wetlands once they are restored. And there are also some other programs, AMA and RCPP, that also benefit wildlife. All right, so just going to go a little deeper dive into the habitats. As we all learned in Bio 101, habitat consists of food, water, and shelter. And what our goal is to try to provide those things for wildlife on these habitats. So first one I'll talk about is grassland bird habitat. And so many species require large contiguous areas of grasses and forbs. Depending on the species, preference for anywhere from 10 to 150 acres of contiguous grassland habitat. There's been a lot of decline in this type of habitat due to development and other types of activities on the landscape that have reduced the amount of grassland. These are the species that use this type of habitat. And the restoration and management activities include establishing native grassland habitat on cropland or pasture, managing existing grasslands, controlling invasive species, and deferring haying or grazing to allow nesting, to allow these species to reproduce successfully. And these are some of the practices that can be used. Moving on to early successional habitat. This is any habitat that is kind of in some stage of succession. And a lot of times this can be old farms or edge habitat. And so the habitat types that are included here are wildlife meadows, pollinator habitat, herbaceous shrub edges, and scrub shrub. The type of restoration and management that can be done is establishing forbs, wildflowers, and grasses and shrubs, managing existing habitat to maintain or enhance the plant community, and removing invasive species. This is really great for both pollinators and for quail. So there's 2 parts of managing for early successional habitat. The native herbaceous practices, and you can use the Maryland Conservation Planting Guide to find mixes that are appropriate for early successional habitat, and the woody component. And again, you can use the Maryland Conservation Planting Guide to find native species that are good for fruit and seed consumption and pollinator food. And you can see the habitat guide for specific guidance on pollinator habitat and bobwhite quail and woodcock habitat, using all the above components as well as some of the additional practices. So for forest habitats, we also have increasing fragmentation, mostly due to development. There are several different forest habitat types, including large forests, where there are forest interior dwelling species, smaller forests where migratory songbirds really love to hang out, forested corridors where wildlife can move from one forested area to another. They really don't, a lot of species really don't like to move out across open fields, so these forested corridors are really important. And then young forests where golden-winged warbler, cerulean warbler, and ruffed grouse prefer. And restoration plans for this type of habitat can include establishing vegetation, managing vegetation, creating habitat structure like brush piles, and controlling undesired vegetation. We work really closely with the Forest Service when we're doing forest habitat restoration plans. They often write forest management plans for us, and these help address the need to maintain desired structure and species composition. So some of the practices include new forest plantings on crop fields, infilling gaps in large blocks of forest, managing existing forests, and removing and controlling invasive species. And here are some of the practices that we use. And just a note for golden-winged warbler, the plans must include these core practices. And also another note that we try not to create golden-winged warbler habitat within areas that have really high quality forest interior dwelling species habitat. But the bottom right map is where we do have kind of priority areas for golden-winged warbler restoration. So moving on to stream and riparian corridor habitats. These are a priority for us because they protect and restore. By protecting these habitats, we can protect and restore fish, freshwater mussels, and neotropical migratory bird habitat. And so these habitats include freshwater streams, riparian buffers, which is the vegetation, both herbaceous and woody vegetation along the edges of streams, and floodplains. So some of the things that can be included in a restoration plan include stabilizing stream head cutting and erosion. This happens a lot on farm fields, and it's important to reduce this as much as possible to reduce the amount of sediment going into streams. Excluding livestock from riparian areas. Like I said, riparian cover is important. Getting permanent vegetation in floodplains is great to slow down flow and also reduce sediment. And then fish passage, ensuring that streams at road stream crossings are not blocked and allow fish passage, and that dams also allow for fish passage. And then invasive plant control. For rare, threatened, and endangered species, the plan can include riparian forest buffers, shrub establishment to establish native forest communities. And then in brook trout areas, aquatic organism passage is really important. So in this lower left map, you can see that brook trout habitat is really intact only in a few places in Maryland, especially out in Western Maryland. Other places, brook trout habitat is much reduced or extirpated. And so, like I said, where there's road stream crossings that are impassable, if we have the opportunity, we can replace these with either fords or bridges that allow fish to pass freely. Okay, moving on to wetlands and shallow water habitat. Like I said, there's many areas in Maryland where agricultural land has been drained. Wetlands have been drained to make agricultural land, and in places where that ag land is wetter than it needs to be productive, it's a good opportunity to restore wetlands and shallow water habitat. Also provides habitat that a lot of producers really like to have on their land for waterfowl. So the habitat types include non-tidal emergent freshwater wetlands, shallow water areas, depression swamps and Delmarva bays, mineral flats, seepage wetlands, tidal marsh, and floodplains. And restoration plans can include restoration of non-tidal and tidal wetlands, restoration of forested wetlands, reconnection of floodplain wetlands, removal of invasive species, and restoration and management of forested wetland vegetated community.
Hey, Julie.
Yep.
I just want to let you know you got about 5 minutes left.
Okay, great. And these are some of the conservation practices that are included, that can be included in restoration plans. Okay, moving on to oyster beds. So we have some unique habitat here in Maryland that in the Chesapeake Bay, we have oyster beds that provide habitat and water quality benefits, but they have been much reduced compared to historic levels. And so we've been able to use the restoration and management of rare declining species practice to work with clients who lease or lease submerged land that are specific shellfish growing waters. And for the restoration plan, we can place 2 inches or 4 inches or bagged shell with spat on culch. So the spat is the baby oysters that you can kind of see in this picture in the top right. And what they're on in this picture is shell, oyster shell, but they can be set, the spat or the baby oysters can be set on other hard surfaces as well, like other types of shell. And finally, I just want to put in a plug. This is just a quick reminder about the CPA 52. This is the environmental evaluation. And so for every conservation plan, you need to check the sensitive species layer on CD to see if you have any state or federally listed species. If you have a state species, you need to send in the sensitive species project review worksheet to Lori Byrne, and that can be found on the FOTG. And if you have a federally listed species, you can use the practice effects document to determine if you need to consult. And if you do, you need to send that practice or the sensitive species project review worksheet into Kathleen Cullen and Lori Byrne. And that was just a quick plug I wanted to get in there about that sensitive species project review. I don't know if Steve, if we have any time for questions.
Yeah, we do have a couple minutes for questions. Anybody has any? All right, not seeing any questions. Julie, thanks for that presentation. Hopefully everybody got some ideas of our different wildlife in Maryland and the types of projects we would work on for wildlife. Next up is Susan Lamb doing a presentation on conservation management systems. And I'll let Susan take it away. I think you're mute.
Yeah, I think I finally hit mute, and I'll hit share and get all my buttons in order here. let's see.
I can see your presentation, but it's not in presenting mode. It's just,
There we go.
yep, looks good.
Hit it twice or thrice. Good afternoon, everyone. I get the pleasure of giving you a photographic overview of conservation management systems that we commonly use in Maryland on cropland, farmstead, and pasture land. This won't be a deep dive into anything in particular. It will be a broad overview. I want to take our minds back briefly to the conservation planning process and the 9 steps of conservation planning. We've got the collection and analysis of information and data about the resources, focusing on the resource concerns. We've got decision support and the application of the plan. So keep those 9 steps in mind as we go through this. And we come over and over to the term resource concern. What is a resource concern? It's the resource condition, and this is the definition out of our planning criteria list document. A resource concern is the resource condition that does not meet the minimum acceptable condition levels as established by resource planning criteria shown in FOTG section 3. And this implies an expected degradation of the soil, water, air, plant, animal, or energy resource base to the extent that sustainability or intended use of the resource is impaired. So that's what a resource concern is, that impairment or lack of sustainability. So first, we'll take a look at cropland and the resource concerns and the practices. And cropland, keep in mind that that includes hayland. So the soil resource concern in cropland's in a very intensive land use. And erosion is a significant resource concern that needs to be treated. And in Maryland, our main erosive force is water. In other more arid parts of the world, of course, it could be wind erosion that is more significant. And in times of drought, wind erosion becomes quite significant. You'll recall Genevieve speaking about how the Soil Conservation Service got its start